Satipatthana, The Direct Path to Realization, which I'm sure some of you have read. But his interest couldn't stop even with that much, but he went on. First in Sri Lanka, he had already studied Pali. When he went back to Germany, he started to study Buddhist Chinese. Then he went on to enroll in, it's like a postdoctoral program. They call it in Europe habilitation, not rehabilitation, not rehab, habilitation. It's like beyond the PhD at the University of Marburg. And there he studied, of course, continued with Buddhist Chinese, Buddhist hybrid Sanskrit, and Tibetan. Did I miss any other? And then his habilitation, that was the kind of dissertation, came to be published fairly recently in 2 massive volumes called The Comparative Study of the Majjhima Nikaya. It's a study of the suttas from the Majjhima Nikaya with all of their parallels from other traditions, parallels preserved in Chinese translation, some in Buddhist hybrid Sanskrit, some or in Buddhist Sanskrit, some in even Tibetan. And so if you really want to, get into the depths of the different traditions of these suttas, I mean, this is the authoritative volume. But we have to find where it's published in the US, or where it's available in the USA, since it's published in Taiwan. But you can just look the title. It's a comparative study of the Majjhima Nikaya. And the name Analayo is A-N long A-L-A-Y-O. And he's also, in the last few years, published many scholarly articles for journals. But he's not only a very painstaking scholar, but also a very diligent meditator. And so when I'm speaking here, I'm feeling a little bit apprehensive. I used to think, oh, we have that young German monk sitting back in Kandy. He don't know nothing. Now I have to speak with fear and trembling. But you're asking, so why are you speaking, Bhante? Why isn't he speaking? I asked him if he would like to speak, and he said that he's just coming from Germany, so he'll be tired. But he will join us for then he wanted to sort of relive the experience of being a young monk sitting in the lecture hall in Kandy and listening to my class. But he will join us for the after-lunch discussion. In fact, he will lead the discussion, so the discussion doesn't have to be confined to the sutta, but any Dharma questions you have in any language. Did you get into Japanese yet? No?
I wanted to thank you both for your scholarship and your practice, both of your work. It's immeasurably helpful. Also, both of you lifting your scholarship for the Bhikkhu Bodhi.
Yeah, you could take this, the microphone.
Just want to thank you for introducing Venerable Magandiya. I'm probably not saying that correctly.
No, that was correct.
So thank you both for your scholarship, your practice, and your publications, your translation, and also linking all of this to the Bhikkhu lineage of Theravada to establish that aspect of equanimity. And perhaps later also, I find that your volume is very difficult, so maybe in the after session, you might be able to ask her about having those. Thanks so much.
Yeah. Okay. Do you have an idea where this book is available, the distributor in the U.S.? Yet, if you give him the microphone.
The problem is that this Dharma publication series is in the beginning, so at present it is very difficult to acquire, and we are finding ways now of finding another distributor.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So at present it's actually almost impossible to buy.
Wow.
But I can give PDF
Mm-hmm.
And within a year's time, it should be available. It should be
Mm. Yeah, yeah.
and this is part of its.
I see. It's a process of.
No, it's copyright, but if you ask me personally, I'll give it to anybody of you. Or I give one to
Or maybe we. Oh, that's a way to do it. Yeah.
I give it to you.
Okay.
Then I give it to, and you can just take it, only you don't put it on the internet.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So you could have it for your private reading, but
But it's very boring, actually.
it's. What happened to Bowe? Okay, anyway, we'll start the sutta. I always have to remember that my eyes are deteriorating. Okay, this is going to be a very powerful sutta. Those of you who have read it know this is sutta number 75 in the Majjhima Nikaya, the Magandiya sutta. And we begin on page 607. And so this is a very powerful sutta. I'm a little bit afraid to teach it because I'm afraid if I teach, the first part, then in next week's class, the number of students will be reduced 75%. Is that Buddhism? I thought it was just about living happily in the here and now. But I think that the sutta gives us a real important lesson, especially in this time of easy pleasure, easily available pleasure. Okay, so let us take a look at the sutta. Okay, the sutta begins, it said, when the Buddha is living in the Kuru country. That's pretty much the area of north central India, almost where Delhi is now. And at this town of the Kuru people named Kamasa Dhamma. And it said, this is the important part that leads into the actual discourse, that he was living on a spread of grass in the fire chamber of a Brahmin belonging to the Bharadvaja clan. Okay, so then one morning the Buddha dressed and he went into the town on his alms round. And then after he collected his alms, then after his meal, he went to a certain grove to spend the day. And he sat down at the foot of a tree and started his daily meditation. And now the protagonist of this sutta, a wanderer named Magandiya, had been walking around for exercise, and then he comes to the fire chamber of the same Brahmin of the Bharadvaja clan. And he sees the spread of grass prepared, and then he asks the Brahmin, who's staying on this grass mat in your fire chamber? For some reason, he's able to infer, it's a little puzzling, he says it looks like it might be an ascetic's bed, a recluse's bed. Maybe he knows that wandering ascetics will often stay in somebody's extra chamber, and they maybe have a distinctive way of rolling out a mat or a stack of grass to make a bed, rather than saying, oh, Bharadvaja, can you bring a very comfortable bed or mattress in? They just take some grass or hay and spread it out. And maybe the Buddha had some personal belongings that he would carry around with him that he left by the mat. So Magandiya was pretty sharp-sighted, so he was able to draw this inference. And so then the Brahmin says that there is now the ascetic named, or the recluse named Gautama, who comes from the Sakyan clan, and now he is staying at this bed of grass, and then this good report has been spreading around about him. Then this is the standard verse of praise to the Buddha, that he's an arahat, fully enlightened, and so on. And so this grass spread has been prepared for Master Gautama. Okay, now when Magandiya hears the name of the ascetic Gautama, he's heard that name before, and he doesn't have such a good impression. He's probably never met the Buddha before in person, but for him, the Buddha has a bad reputation. And he says, this is a little awkward. Okay, thank you. Careful, this stripping. It's okay, don't worry about it. Chifan, don't worry, it's okay now. Okay, so when Magandiya hears this, he says, it's an ill sight that we see when we see that bed prepared for Master Gautama. Then he uses an expression here in Pali. It's a very unusual expression. Buddha. Was it Huna or Hana? Hanu? Hanu? Huna? No, the second part. Huna? Okay. This would be okay? Okay, thank you. Okay, now this translation is based on, you see, it was a very unusual expression. So this translation follows the commentary, which the commentary explains this as Vadihataka, which means literally like one who destroys growth. And then I looked up this expression, well, of course, in the Pali dictionaries, I found it there, in the Pali English dictionary. I looked for it in the Sanskrit English dictionary, couldn't find it there. And I looked in the Buddhist hybrid Sanskrit dictionary, couldn't find it there. So apparently it's not a commonly used expression. And what the commentary says, which is the basis for this translation, it's not completely satisfying to me. But I found a useful hint. Of course, whenever I give these talks on any sutta, I always have to consult the authority to find out what parallels might say. So, in a way, Venerable Analayo has become my guide to the to the parallel versions to the Majjhima Nikaya. Yeah, I think it was B.C. Law who, in my opinion, B.C. Law, and somebody named Saxena, it looks like. I have to bring my other pair of glasses to these classes in the future. I'm seeing everything as pretty much as a blur. But these scholars, B.C. Law and this one Saxena, speculate that the original sense was the killer of embryos. In other words, one who produces abortions, an abortionist, you might say. Do you think that's a workable? Yeah, we just have conjecture. But it seemed to have been a term that had a bad designation, because when Magandiya says this, then the Brahmin says, "Be careful what you say, Magandiya. Be careful what you say. Many learned learned nobles, Brahmins, householders, as well as other learned ascetics, have complete confidence in this Master Gotama, and then they've been trained by him in the noble path and this good, wholesome Dhamma." Then Magandiya, he seems to be a rather boastful person, so he says, one of these, "You're not going to deter me with that cheap shot Brahmin." So he says, "Master Bharadvaja, even if I saw Master Gotama face to face, I would tell him right to his face, you are a Bunahuna. You're a destroyer of growth or an abortionist." And then he says, why is that? Because that has come down in our discourse. Apparently, they wouldn't have had written scriptures, but apparently there was some kind of authoritative oral tradition which he had learned maybe from his teachers and his teachers and teachers, which ascribed this bad designation, this pejorative term, to the one that we call the Buddha. And then Bharadvaja says, if you have no objection, may I tell Master Gotama that? And then Magandiya, again, he's a little bit arrogant, and so he says, I have no objection at all. You could tell him anything that you want. You could even say that to Master Gotama. You could tell him just what I said. But meanwhile, the Buddha has this special faculty of hearing that we call the divine ear, so that he could hear sounds and conversations going on at a distance. And so he heard this conversation taking place from his meditation seat beneath the tree in the grove where he was staying. So then in the evening or late afternoon, he arose from his meditation, and he came back to the fire chamber. He sits down on the spread of grass that's been prepared. And then the Brahmin comes to the Buddha, and after exchanging greetings, the Buddha asks the Brahmin, he says, did you have some conversation with the wanderer Magandiya about this spread of grass? So the Buddha is trying to, in an indirect way, open up that conversation. And then the Brahmin is awestruck, and it says his the hairs of his body are standing on end, and he said, I wanted to tell Master Gotama about that very same thing, but you already knew what took place. Okay, and then while they're speaking, the wanderer Magandiya, who maybe he was just hanging around outside the house, just waiting for the Buddha to return. That's my hypothesis. So he was probably itching to start a fight with the Buddha, a debate. So when the Buddha, he knows that the Buddha is inside the fire chamber, he just kind of like nonchalantly comes strolling in, like he doesn't really know what's happening, putting on a pretense of this air of noble indifference. And, like, well, what a surprise. Look who's here. Okay, so he comes up to the Buddha. They exchange what's said courteous and amiable talk. Okay, and then the Buddha starts the discourse to Magandiya. He says, Magandiya, he's going to bring out the implications that Magandiya had when he used the expression. So the Buddha says, The I delights in forms, takes delight in forms, rejoices in forms. And that is the I, has been tamed by the Tathagata, guarded, protected, and restrained. And he teaches the Dhamma for its restraint, the restraint of the I faculty. Was it reference to this that you said that I'm a destroyer of growth or an abortionist? And then I would assume that actually in the real conversation, the Buddha would have gone through all of the senses first. Or maybe he would have just expressed it concisely that the sense organs delight in their objects, but because the form of the discourse always spells out each individual sense faculty. But I would put Magandiya's answer at the end. So the Buddha will say the eye delights in forms, the ear delights in sounds, the nose in odors, the tongue in flavors, the body in tangible sensations, the mind in mental objects, and so on. And the Tathagata has tamed and mastered all of this, and he teaches the Dhamma for the restraint of the sense faculties. Was it with reference to this that you called me a destroyer of growth? And then Magandiya says, it was exactly with reference to that, Master Gotama, that I said, you are an abortionist, a destroyer of growth. For what reason? Because that's recorded in our scriptures. Even though they're not written scriptures, but in our textual tradition, we could say. And so we could see what the point of disagreement is here between the Buddha and Magandiya. Even though Magandiya is described as a wanderer, and so we think of the wanderers in India at the Buddha's time as being kind of ascetics, but it seems that Magandiya could have belonged to a community that believed in, you don't get tied down by the household, bearing children and having to work for a living and, cultivate the land or work at a profession. But he might have belonged to a community of wanderers such as that described in an earlier sutta in Majjhima Nikaya. I think it's sutta number 45. This is on page 405. If you turn to that, the shorter discourse on ways of undertaking things. And then we come in paragraph 3, section 3. The Buddha is speaking about certain recluses and Brahmins who hold the doctrine and view there is no harm in sensual pleasures, and then they take to gulping down sensual pleasures and divert themselves with women wanderers who wear their hair bound up in a topknot. So these are kind of, maybe we would call them hedonists or sensualists, but they still, outwardly, they live the life of wandering ascetics. They're not tied down with household responsibilities. And they even have their own doctrine about nirvana or nibbana, as we'll see. This is the view of nibbana, which is expressed in the Brahmajala Sutta, the first sutta in the Digha Nikaya, that when a person is fully supplied with all the pleasures of the senses and can freely indulge them, that, they say, is supreme nirvana in this present life. So it seems Magandiya might have been coming from that tradition. And so when he heard the reports that this ascetic Gautama is going around saying, control the eye, control the ear, control the nose, control the senses, control the mind, he would have thought, wow, our American expression would be killjoy. Maybe that's what it is. Though Buna means what grows, not joy. But we would call it, in American English, a killjoy. He's really, just a drag, man. like a strict Sunday school teacher with a ruler who hits the students. Don't talk in class, Johnny. No pleasure, no fun. So that's his picture of the Buddha, just one of these stern, grumpy, ascetic types. Okay, so now the Buddha is going to pick up on this and explore the thesis, the underlying view of Magandiya and his group. So he starts with, in his own way, with asking questions. He says, what do you think, Magandiya? Here someone might have formerly enjoyed himself with forms cognizable by the eye, wished for, desired, agreeable and likable, connected with sensual desire, and provocative of lust. On a later occasion, having understood as they actually are the origin, the disappearance or passing away, the gratification, the danger, and the escape in the case of forms, he might abandon the craving for forms, remove the fever, that's the fever of passion, passionate desire for forms, and he'll dwell without thirst, with a mind inwardly at peace. What would you say to him, Magandiya? Like Magandiya is like pushed into a corner. He's not this one who understands the nature of forms from these 5 important angles, that they arise and pass away, so they're impermanent. He understands that they give enjoyment, that's the gratification in them. He understands the danger or unsatisfactoriness in them. Probably the Buddha in the actual discourse, he would have elaborated on this, but the compilers can just, because they have other discourses to refer to, so to make it easy to transmit orally, they just compress it into one little formula. So the danger is that these forms and other sense objects are impermanent, not really deeply satisfying, and he knows the escape or release from bondage to these forms and other sense objects. And then the key word is that he's dwelling free from the fever for forms. The Buddha here is depicting lust or passion as a kind of heated condition. And in India, it's not like in the West when in the winter we like to be warm. But in India, where it's usually warm, then an excess of warmth becomes like a feverish condition, which is unpleasant. And so then he abides without thirst, inwardly at peace. So when Magandiya is asked, what do you have to say to him? You're going to tell him, come on, man, we have some nice forms to enjoy. Enjoy them. So Magandiya must realize that's only going to be stirring up more passion, more fever, more fire in this person whose mind is inwardly at peace. So what could he say? Nothing. Okay, the same thing is repeated for each of the other senses, including the mind objects. Yeah.
I wonder what would be the Pali term for this gratification?
Oh, gratification. In fact, that's a good question, though. We have these three terms that there's adinava. I'm sorry, for gratification is asada, which I think literally is connected with the idea of tasting something which is sweet. So some of the early translators use the expression, their sweet taste. Then adinava is something like the misery or the unsatisfactoriness in these things. Then nisarana means the way out, way that leads out. And the way out is usually expressed as the removal of desire and passion. The abandoning and removal of desire and passion, desire and lust. Okay, so now first the Buddha began with this, call it an impersonal presentation, just speaking about somebody. But now the Buddha is going to speak directly from his own experience. So he says, Magandiya, and don't forget that the Buddha, the story that he was the son of a king is no doubt a later sort of exaggeration, but he came from the aristocratic, because the Sakyan country was a republic, but the Buddha came from an aristocratic family. So his father could have been like the senior member of the ruling council. So the Buddha had it pretty easy in his pre-renunciation days. So he says, formerly when I lived the household life, I enjoyed myself, provided and endowed with the 5 objects of sensual pleasure. That's delightful forms, sounds, odors, tastes, tactiles, and, just tactiles. Then he said, I had 3 palaces or 3 mansions, one for each of the seasons. In northern India, they have 3 seasons. There's the rainy season, which is usually from June, July, August, or July, August, September, October. Then after that comes the cool season, the pleasant season, which is usually like November, December, January, February. Then comes the end of February, it starts to get warm. Then comes the hot season, March, April, May, and June. So, just like we have a heater in the winter, then when the summer comes, we turn off the heater and we put on the air conditioner. So the Buddha, because he was quite well off, he had separate buildings which were constructed differently. So the building for the hot season was probably much more spacious, more open, big windows so the air would come through. For the winter or cold season was probably more compressed, so to hold in the heat. And the rainy season, I don't know, it might have had something to dry up, to make things dry, I don't know what. And he said, during the 3 months of 4 months of the rainy season, I lived in the Rains Palace, enjoying myself with musicians, none of whom were men. So it said that all of his musicians were women, and none of whom were men. I wonder if some of them could have been like eunuchs. I don't know. It seems a little strange expression rather than saying explicitly that they were all women. And I did not go down to the lower palace, the lower floor of the palace. He could just stay up on the 2nd floor, or maybe even 3rd floor, and his servants would bring his meals to him. Others would come and take away the plates and dishes. So he was really like living quite the life of an easy life. Okay, but now he says, on a later occasion, having understood as they really are the origin, disappearance, gratification, danger, and escape, in the case of sensual pleasures, I abandoned the craving for them, I removed the fever about them. And now I myself dwell without thirst, with a mind inwardly at peace. Okay, so now the Buddha is the one who fulfills the previous example that he gave. So he's showing that he's talking about this from his own experience. And now he says, I see other beings or people who are not free from lust for sensual pleasures. Now this is where it gets pretty strong. Being devoured by the craving for sensual pleasures, burning with the fever for sensual pleasures, indulging in sensual pleasures. So, we see on television, or people see on television, the movies, the hero is living in the penthouse apartment. He has, maybe 3 or 4 girlfriends. He comes down in Prius. He's a little hip to the environmental crisis, so he uses a Prius. Not completely wasteful. He wants to show that he has that he's a green consumer. Or maybe he likes a little red sports car, and he has, finest wines and whiskeys on his. They have like a little inbuilt bar in his penthouse apartment, and people see this and they think, especially I have to say, in Asia, people see, wow, life in America, wow. And they're living like, this is my experience. We used to go on alms round up this hill, and we look in the distance, and you see the beautiful hills in the distance, green fields. And imagine the people are living so simply and happily, contentedly. But then this comes on the television and the movies. Can I get a ticket to America? But you won't be living like that in America. You'll have to, work 8-10 hours a day, living, in the city apartment. And look at the beautiful view you have here. Quite, you only have to work a few hours a day during the growing season. You don't want to go to America, do you? Yeah, can you get me a ticket? Yeah. Yeah, so people see that and, they're envious. That's why like Playboy magazine, it's so popular, because everybody is envying this, what's his name? Hugh Hefner, is that the name? Excuse me? Hugh Hefner, who's now 83 years old and he has 3 girlfriends? Okay, but the Buddha says, I look out at these people and I do not envy them, nor do I delight in the kinds of pleasures that they're delighting in. So what is the reason? Now he says, like a really key statement. He says, there is, Magandiya, a delight. I think he uses the word rati, if I remember, which in normal usage, it signifies the delight of sense pleasures. But here the Buddha is using this in another sense. He says it's the delight apart from sensual pleasures, apart from unwholesome mental states or mental qualities, and which surpasses even divine bliss. If we're not interested in sense pleasures, but even in the Buddha's time, many of the people who were living a religious life were doing so with the thought, I give it up in this life, in the next life I sort of go to the karmic bank and I collect all of the funds that have been built up there by getting to enjoy, to be reborn in heaven. Then I get the beautiful nymphs, or the women get the handsome young goddess, the women get the handsome young god, handsome young deity, and we get the delightful music. All of the bliss of this celestial sense pleasures. But the Buddha here is speaking about a delight apart from sensual pleasures, even divine or heavenly sense pleasures. And since I take delight in that, I do not envy what is inferior. So the Buddha's here, he's sort of describing sense pleasures as inferior, and I don't take delight in them. And now what is this bliss, this super sensory delight that the Buddha is speaking about? I think the commentary explains this, if I remember, as the commentary says that this is the attainment of the fruit of arhatship, the meditative attainment of the fruit of arhatship based on the fourth jhana. I'll write a very big, long expression. Arahata Pala Samapatti, which means it's supposed to be a special meditative attainment or meditative state available to the Arhat, in which he can go into this state and experience the bliss of Nibbana for as long as he predetermines. Whether this was the Buddha's actual intention, that I don't know, because this description that's given here could even apply to the jhanas. But the Arahata Pala Samapatti, these correspond to the jhanas, to the levels of the jhanas, but they have Nibbana as their object, rather than the ordinary object of jhana. But this could just be just the bliss of the jhanas. We don't know for certain. Okay, now the Buddha is going to start using some analogies in order to try to drive home the point more clearly to Magandiya. So he says, suppose we have a rich householder or young householder, the son of the householder, has all of the kinds of sense pleasures he might desire. And then he behaves well. He's a morally upright person. He behaves well with body, speech, and mind. And so when he dies, he takes rebirth in a happy realm in one of the heavenly worlds. And the Buddha mentions here, the Tavatingsa Devas, the gods of the heaven of the 33. It's one of the sensory realm heavenly worlds. And there he's surrounded by a group of nymphs in the Nandana Grove, enjoying himself with the 5 objects of divine or heavenly sense pleasure. So now he could look down at huge Hefner, and you know the way children, when they get a special privilege that the other child doesn't have, that their brother or sister doesn't have, they go like this, or like this. So he's looking down at heaven, at huge Hefner, huge Hefner sporting himself with his 3 girlfriends in the room with all of the mirrors. And he goes, okay, so he looks down, he sees a householder or householder's son enjoying himself, provided and endowed with the 5 objects of human sense pleasures. Okay, so what do you think? Would that newborn deity up there, enjoying the divine sense pleasures, envy the human householder who's enjoying the human sense pleasures? Or would he want to leave the heavenly world and come down? No, he wouldn't, certainly not. And Magandiya gives the reason. He says, why not? Because divine or heavenly sense pleasures are more excellent, more sublime than the human sense pleasures. Okay, so then the Buddha repeats the same passage, the same statement that he made earlier, that he used, when he lived the home life, he was able to enjoy all of the types of sense pleasures, but now that he's abandoned them and has a mind inwardly at peace, when he sees other people enjoying the human sense pleasures, then he doesn't envy them or long to enjoy those types of pleasures. And so the reason is because he knows, he experiences a kind of delight apart from sense pleasures, which surpasses even divine bliss. Okay, before I go into the next section, does anybody have any questions on anything taken up so far? Just on the text itself, I don't want to go off into side issues, because what's going to come is still in continuity with this. But just anything that's a little unclear. Katie? Oh, the word rati. Is it rati? Do you remember? Yeah, I think it was, yeah. Excuse me? Oops. Any other questions, comments? Okay, then we'll go on. Okay, and here I was quite interested to see in Venerable Analayo's treatment of this sutta, comparing it with the version that's come down in the Majjhima Agama. That's a version of the counterpart of the Majjhima Nikaya that has come down in the Chinese translation. I hope I didn't lose that. That version had these similes in a somewhat different order, and that got me thinking, and I came up with still another sequence that seems to me more